Welcome back, guys. Today we're going to continue looking at the American Revolution. Today we're going to specifically look at the war in the Carolinas, the war, what's going on in North and South Carolina. And so first, before we get to any of the battles, we're going to do a little bit of background information. So some background info. Things that are just good to know before we get into the battles themselves. All right. So in 1778, at this point, the war has been going on. The fighting has been going on for 3 years, right? Warfare back and forth for 3 years. But also in 1778, it's important to note that, and this is going to be very poorly drawn, North Carolina. What's going on in North Carolina at this time? Well, you got a very large very large loyalist population. If you remember, these are colonists that are living in the colonies that are pro-England, that don't necessarily want war. But a year later, 1779, it's looking like these loyalists are going to get what they want. Okay? It's looking like the loyalists are going to get what they want because what you have is a situation where, and again, this is just poorly drawn, but hopefully you'll get the idea. South Carolina and Georgia, right? Well, in South Carolina and Georgia, Great Britain has gone into both of these places. They've not only gone in, they've gone in and taken control, established themselves. And they've decided it's time to go north. We need North Carolina. But it's hot. See, in 1779, it is a typical, those of us that have lived in North Carolina summers know it's a typical North Carolina summer. It's hot, it's humid. If you get stuck outside, it's miserable. All right? So they decide that they're going to wait. Before they proceed north into North Carolina. This is a huge mistake. Because what happens is the Continental Army and the Patriots start to realize that there's a large group of loyalists here. England has a stronghold in the southern portion of the colonies. So they send people to North Carolina, hoping to get some of these loyalists on their side. And so what you see in 1780, and this is why this is important. In 1780 in North Carolina, there are some changes. There's some differences. And that is because of what I just said. Because England decides to wait before they go in and attempt to invade again, poorly drawn North Carolina, but you get the point. In 1780, what you have, what we drew out as 4 people, all of which were loyalists. What you have in just 2 years, a shift in mindset and a shift in thinking, where you have go colonies, You have a group of patriots that are emerging. Then you got a group of neutralists that have kind of watched this war and are meh, they don't care either way. And then now all of a sudden the loyalists don't have as great of a numbers advantage over the patriots as they did. In fact, there's probably fewer of them. So what started off as a very, very large loyalist population just 2 years prior has now dwindled down to the point where patriots make up the majority. And so this is the background information for what we're about to talk about. We're going to look at 2 early battles in South Carolina first. 2 battles in South Carolina first. All right? And so the first one is Charlestown, South Carolina, which would later become Charleston. Charlestown, South Carolina. And Charlestown is a major port. It's a major opportunity for the colonies to ship goods back and forth to one another. So what England does is they take troops that are in New York, where they have a very strong hold, and they ship them down to South Carolina. These British ships Britain sends their ships down to South Carolina, and they have approximately 13,000, I'm sorry, numbers are hard, 13,000 troops on these ships. And what ends up happening is they ship them down there, and the result is a very, very quick capture. Quickly captured. And this is huge because it gives Britain a port that they can send supplies and soldiers to, but also shuts down a major port that the colonies were using. And so they're losing control in South Carolina. The colonies are losing control in South Carolina. And so that brings us to Camden, South Carolina. And in Camden, South Carolina, you have a fort that is essentially protecting North Carolina. It's one of the last lines of defense before they get to North Carolina. And so the troops that are actually in North Carolina are tired of waiting for a potential invasion. And instead, they travel to the British in Camden. Camden has been occupied by the British. North Carolina is expecting them. 2,400 troops travel to the South Carolina group, right? They travel to South Carolina, 2,400. Well, what ends up happening is that it's 2,400 versus 8,300, over 8,000, 8,300 soldiers that are waiting for them in South Carolina. And based on numbers alone, the colonies, unable to win that. And this leaves North Carolina, lo and behold, wide open for the taking. North Carolina is wide open. Boom, opportunity there. But again, we talked about it over here. It's too high. Too high. We don't want to do that yet. And so it allows the colonies some time to kind of regroup. And there's a battle right on the border at Cowpens. All right, there's a battle. I'm sorry. I'm going to do this one in a different color because it's still proceeding north. We're getting closer and closer to North Carolina. And this one is at Cowpens right along the border. Today it is in South Carolina, but then the battle probably took place right over the borders. But Cowpens is when finally Great Britain has decided to go to North Carolina. They are on their way to NC. They're on their way to North Carolina. They're fighting. They're battling. You have the British soldier here, and you got them versus the colonies that are trying to hold their own. And what ends up happening is that the colonies start to retreat. They start to run. And they're running. And they're running. And they're running. And the British chase them. Because they want full control. They want to conquer everything they can. And what looks like a normal retreat actually is not. It's a setup. It's a setup because in that retreat, the soldiers are told to stop and fire. Every now and then they are supposed to stop and fire. Right as the British got close up and were unprepared for the stop, that was the advantage that the colonies had. The colonies knew when their running was going to stop. They would stop, they would turn around. The British didn't know. The British are just chasing. The British are just chasing. And so the leader of the colonial troops at the time tells his soldiers to stop, hide, and wait until you can see the whites of their eyes. The order is to stop and fire once you see the whites of their eyes. Once they get close enough, you unleash. Make sure you are not going to miss. And while this chase is carrying on, it's a planned retreat. It's a planned retreat. It's supposed to happen. And so the fact that the British are chasing them actually plays into the advantage of the colonies, and you start to get the British retreating. And the British start to retreat back. And so while they were making advantages in Charleston and Camden of getting into and capturing North Carolina, Cowpens is it puts them way behind because this is an onslaught. The colonies, because of this planned retreat and this planned kind of sneak attack, I guess, of sorts, the British are not ready at all for this style of warfare, and it allows the colonies a major victory there at Cowpens. And so the British retreat back, and now they have to reassess. They got to come up with a new plan. And so that brings us to Kings Mountain, North Carolina. Kings Mountain, North Carolina is when the British finally do go, once again, they go to North Carolina. And the belief, again, is that they have a large group. They believe that they have a large group of loyalists waiting for them there. Well, turns out that in the Appalachian Mountains, which is where this is taking place, out here on the coast, in the Appalachian Mountains, you have a bunch of what would be called mountain men. And it's exactly what you would think of. Just big, burly, bearded men wearing a big hat. All right? So you have mountain men. Well, the reason that the British were able to get into North Carolina via the Appalachian Mountains is that these mountain men tended to be neutralists. They tended to be neutralists. They were that meh group. And the plan, which means that the planned loyalists that they thought were going to be there, they don't exist. These guys are not there, which completely goes against the British plan. The mountain men they don't care either way, but they are willing to fight. And that is why there wasn't really anyone there to stop the British from getting into Kings Mountain. So what ends up happening is they start fighting. It becomes the mountain men versus the British. And again, the mountains are a very treacherous region. It's hard to fight in the mountains. It's hard to move around. The climate is different. And so what ends up happening is the fighting leads to the British running. They are running from the mountain men. And this all means that North Carolina is able to stay unconquered. And it becomes a victory of sorts, even though it was kind of done by a group of people that didn't care one way or the other. They didn't really care about North Carolina being free. These mountain men cared about the Appalachian Mountains where they lived being free. So they go into Kings Mountain. The British are able to finally get into North Carolina, but because they could not defeat these mountain men in the Appalachian Mountains, and because those loyalists were not there to help conquer them, the British are forced to run, keeping North Carolina a free colony at the time, which brings us to arguably the most important battle that takes place in the Carolinas, and that is the battle at Guilford Courthouse. The battle at Guilford Courthouse takes place in Greensboro. And it all starts when Washington names Nathaniel Greene. Nathaniel Greene had been fighting or had been controlling the colonial troops in Rhode Island. And he names it, he moves it. Washington moves Nathaniel Greene south. He wants Nathaniel Greene in charge in North Carolina. So Washington takes Nathaniel Greene and redirects him to North Carolina. And so the first thing that Nathaniel Greene does when he gets there is he has his North Carolina militia. The North Carolina military group, and he divides them into Group 1 and Group 2. And this allows him to it makes them more mobile. They're smaller units, so he can move them quicker, faster, which allows them to utilize hit and run attacks. They were able to run, boom, hit the British. It wasn't designed to take out large numbers of the British, but if you take out 10 at a time consistently, you're going to start chipping away at the numbers that the British have. And so these hit and run tactics kind of baits the British in. And they're sitting there, and what happens is that Britain jumps all over it. Britain takes the bait. They go in there, they take the bait, and in Greensboro, North Carolina, you have the colonies, once again, versus the British. Except this time, again, it's a weaker British force because A, the hit and run tactics, and B, we discussed this during the colonial strength versus British weakness video. The longer the war went and the more places that the British had to go, they had to keep splitting their army, keep splitting their army. And so this large group is more manageable now. And so it all comes back to the colonies being able to fight on their home turf. And so what happens is about 1/4, 25% of the British forces in Greensboro die. 25% of that army is defeated. And so they retreat. They run. But they go to Wilmington, where again is another port city, an opportunity for them to try to keep hold of the port so that they can have stuff shipped to them. So while they retreat to Wilmington, the American colonies don't chase them. They proceed south. Because as these soldiers are going to Wilmington, they're leaving other portions with British control in the south unguarded. And by the time the British realize that the colonies are going south to take control of these British-controlled regions that they've left empty, too late. They're forced to scramble. And so what you have here in a pictorial form is the American Revolution in the Carolinas. Now, obviously, this is not all of it. There were more smaller battles. But these are your major important battles. And it all starts in 1778 when there was a large loyalist group. And this is 3 years into the war. But again, as the war continues, that group starts to get smaller and smaller. And the Patriot group starts to get bigger and bigger. And in 1779, when the British had complete control in South Carolina and Georgia, they wait because it's too hot to go and try to conquer North Carolina. Ends up being their very, very large mistake because initially, Charleston, Camden, they take control. Everything's in place. They got a plan in place. You can see the route to taking over North Carolina. Cowpens, they get a major defeat, completely defeated. Lose a large chunk of people. They weren't ready for the retreat, the stop and fire style of battle that they faced. They go into Kings Mountain, where they believe they will come in contact with a loyalist group. That loyalist group is not there. Those mountain men tend to be the neutralists that were going to fight whichever army went there first. And it just happened to be the British. And because those mountain men are able to defeat the British, mainly because of the region that they're fighting in and the fact that it is the mountains, that leaves North Carolina free. North Carolina is not conquered. That gives Washington time to put one of his best generals in North Carolina, Nathaniel Greene, splits his army into two groups, allowing them to conduct hit-and-run tactics to slowly, over time, chip away at the number of soldiers that were there. They bait Great Britain into Greensboro, where they're able to take out 25% of the remaining British forces. And while Britain retreats to Wilmington, the colonies don't chase them. They go south. They go south to try and retake some of the stuff that they lost in the early years of the war. But we're going to stop here. We have an assignment on campus. We're going to continue with the American Revolution until they're not the colonies anymore. They are the United States. But we are going to stop here. You can see the tide starting to turn. If you have any questions about your assignment on campus, please reach out to me. And as always, have a great day.